we'd invite you to come back now and join us in the room, and if possible, as we have done for the rest of the conference today, to turn on your cameras in order to promote participation and discussion and engagement on all of the variety of topics that we're going to cover in this workshop. So as you know, this workshop is focused on women's rights, and I think picking up on the conversation that we just had and just been part of with Dr. Mike Ryan, this is another area of high priority in terms of social justice, equality, and we can really see through Dr. Mike Ryan's presentation and the points that he made in his discussion, you know, that gender equality and women's rights have been hugely impacted, you know, in particular in terms of the lockdowns and the policy responses, access to participation and decision-making spaces, and women really experiencing the forefront of the challenges that we've all experienced over the last 18 months. So I'm delighted now to open the conversation and welcome our two speakers. Because of the short time frame that we have, I would normally go around the room and invite everyone to share where they're from, but I think we're really quite tight on time with just an hour. So instead, we all have our names up. I'd invite you to rename and add your conversation if you'd like, as well, or add your organization as well if you'd like. And when you do participate a little bit later after we hear from our two speakers, or two invited speakers, that you would maybe say where you're from and your particular area of work, and then in that way we can get to know each other a little bit better. And I'd just like to remind you as well of the chat function at the bottom, so please do add in any comments or questions that you might have for our speakers as we go through the next part, and feel free as well to connect with each other. I'll just introduce our two speakers and we'll kick it off. We're going to use a conversation format, which was similar to what was used in the last session, which I think is nice and really opens it up because we really want to hear your voices as well as we go through the next hour. So very welcome to Maria Joyce. Maria Joyce is a coordinator of the National Traveller Women's Forum. Maria is a traveller activist. She's worked for many years now in the traveller movement for human rights. She's a graduate of Maynooth and a community worker, and you know, fully committed in her professional and personal life to, you know, traveller equality and also to women's equality. And Jennifer McCarthy Flynn, you're very welcome as well. Jennifer is the head of policy at the National Women's Council, so many of you will know both Jennifer and Maria. And Jennifer is leading on the development of the National Women's Council policy and advocacy work. She supports the team to deliver the ambitious goals of the strategic plan, No Woman Left Behind, which is the current strategy running from 2021 to 2024. Jennifer has a background in community development and advocacy and activism as well, also international development, and an expertise in women's community education, gender-based violence, and mental health. Jennifer has worked in the NGO sector for over 25 years, and she also is a practicing psychotherapist in community-based mental health organisations. So we're going to kick off the conversation with our two speakers by just, I suppose, asking you to comment on what you've heard, you know, from Dr. Mike Ryan this morning and from the Minister, and really focusing our conversation, I suppose, to start with what do we know about the impact of COVID on women, you know, from what women have shared, from the work that you've been doing on the ground yourselves. Could you just tell us a little bit more, I suppose, to set the context of women's experience of the COVID-19 pandemic in Ireland? So maybe Jennifer, you could start, and then we'll hand over to Maria.
Great, thanks Ciara, and thanks to Community Work Ireland for asking the National Women's Council to come along and participate in this really interesting event today. I suppose the thing that really struck me listening to Dr. Ryan was how he really touched, I suppose, on what some of the key issues actually were for women, I think, during COVID-19. I was particularly struck by the way in which he highlighted the difference between being able to be part of the decision making, and obviously he was primarily talking about COVID and health, but I think it's a distinction that's applicable to all of the work, being able to be part of the decision making or just being expected to be the passive beneficiaries, in this case of healthcare, but in general of services, of development, and so on, and making that distinction, which I think probably, like most people here in the workshop today, the National Women's Council really sees that as being a huge issue around women's rights and women's equality, and certainly very much at play during COVID-19, where women were very much not represented in decision-making spaces, not represented in leadership, and therefore at very key moments, the needs of women were not really being considered or being taken into account, whether it was just very simply women returning from maternity leave not being considered when the original wage subsidy schemes was being set up, to even now still some hospitals refusing to allow women to have their partners with them while they're actually labouring, often not in easy labouring situations either. So really just those two pieces, one at the beginning of the pandemic, when say, if you like, the primary support and intervention to support people's income was being developed, and then right now, even at this end of the COVID-19. And then I suppose the other piece was his really strong emphasis on how COVID-19 is a terrible illness, is a terrible disease, but really intersects with that whole piece around the social determinants of health. So I think all existing inequalities, injustices, and discriminations were just made so much worse by this pandemic. So lone parents, travellers, ethnic minority women, women who are being trafficked, sexually exploited, disabled women, all suffered so much more during this pandemic. And overall, women who were 70% of essential workers remained the lowest paid. The expectation and the reality was that women would take on increased caring roles, whether it was children and schooling at home or the needs of family members and community members. And women entered this pandemic with fewer resources, less wealth, lower incomes, greater unpaid care responsibility, a much higher reliance on low paid and precarious work. And the pandemic made all of that worse. And I think Dr. Ryan's, highlighting of that really resonates with the experiences of women in the National Women's Council. We undertook a survey of women's experiences of caring during COVID, and that really came out hugely. The mental health impact, the physical health impact on women as they took up all these additional caring responsibilities, the impact on their mental health was enormous. And as I think probably most of you saw, because to really say the state, one thing that the state did do well during COVID was responding around the issue of violence against women. And there was an enormous jump. Women's Aid recorded a 43% increase in calls to services during 2020. The Garda recorded a 16% increase on calls, which unfortunately they didn't always respond to, as we know. But probably the biggest issue that we saw not being addressed and continuing to be not being addressed as we built forward into recovery, was really a complete unwillingness to accept the key role of care, particularly public childcare. And so that has continued to be one of the biggest issues for women. It was one of the biggest issues during the pandemic and continues now to be a huge issue as we go forward into recovery. The complete unacceptance of the necessity to have a properly resourced and functioning care system and economy in Ireland, both for women who need care and for women who provide care. So we have some of the most expensive, unregulated care in Europe, and we have some of the lowest paid care workers in Europe as well. And that's just a real disaster for women's rights and women's equality in two ways. Women who want to work and coming into workforces that is precarious, low paid, unregulated, heavily dominated by women from ethnic minority groups. So there's a real discrimination and exploitation happening there. And then for women who want to work and need care in order to support that, being unable to do so. So those are some of the real key issues there. There's loads more I could say, and I'm sure it'll come out in the conversations, but I'm going to hand over to Maria to, to talk, I suppose, particularly about that intersection with traveller women, and maybe we can talk about some of the other issues as we go on in the conversation.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. And I suppose just before I go into some of the issues in terms of the kind of impact of COVID in terms of traveller women, I just do want to make a brief point in relation to the issue of areas of research and surveys and analysis that have been done over the last 18 months or so since March of 2020. and the onset of COVID. And I suppose the need to ensure, I mean, much of those surveys and pieces of research that are emerging, even where traveller organisations and traveller women have fed into those surveys, they are not reflecting. And certainly there are some departments who are not seeing the relevance of ensuring how COVID has impacted on the particular experience of traveller women. And I think, it is very much linked to the conversations this morning in terms of meaningful participation, in terms of engagement in decision making. They'll consult and they'll ask, but there is no meaningful input into decision making. There isn't even a meaningful reflection of the particular experiences of traveller women, be it COVID or other issues, and in relation to the impact and the particular experiences, including the particular form of racism that is experienced by traveller women, and which is which does lead to the exclusion of traveller women from decision-making spaces, or not seen as needing to have them around the table. In terms of the particular experience, in terms of the impact of racism, I mean, we've heard this morning, I mean, travellers have been living with a disproportionate impact of COVID-19. We've heard the issues experienced by marginalised and ethnic groups and the underlying health inequalities that exist, and the impact of that in terms of the onset of COVID, and also, that link as well in terms of the key health determinants in the session this morning by speakers. But I mean, core to this is the health concerns traveller women have had for their own families, given those stark health inequalities. Also, women in primary healthcare projects and working in traveller organisations have had a real role in ensuring the right information was getting out. Engaging with the HSE in relation to their responses with the community and trying to ensure the measures taken by the state were responding to the issues facing travellers from the impact of COVID. And they can always go hand in hand in terms of those responses. Living in substandard accommodation as well, and poorly serviced sites and unauthorised accommodation, and living, in overcrowded accommodation, has made it very difficult for very many traveller women to ensure their families are fully protected. And just an example of that, and particularly, I suppose, in terms of their children, even complying with the most basic advice from the HSE, it's difficult to adhere to that public health advice in relation to the importance of hand hygiene if you don't have basic running water and other basic services. It's difficult to adhere to that advice in relation to self-isolation if you're living in chronic overcrowded conditions and have nowhere to separate yourself from your family or your community in relation to that. And while some local authorities did take some measures, by no means did they go far enough, and very many of them still have not done, put in basic provisions to address some of these very real issues. And I'm going to finish with this point in relation to some of the impact, because I think it's a really important one as well, is the impact it has had on education with school closures and the community. Where travellers are already very vulnerable in relation to educational disadvantage in terms of many of our children, trying to engage with online and remote learning has been very challenging for families where they did not have access to online platforms. And that phrase, digital divide, has had a significant impact on traveller children's education. We know from some surveys and research that local groups have done in their areas that 4 out of 5 families in some of those areas did not have Wi-Fi or a device where their children could engage with online platforms. And just even the very basic thing of where traveller children were trying to do school and young traveller adults were trying to do school and college work by the light of their mobile phone because they didn't have electricity or generators went off at a certain time. So those are the very practical impact of decades and decades of that inequality that was spoken about this morning, decades and decades of institutional racism. And, while there's been consultation mechanisms, we have not had real decision making inputs into real decision making, and we certainly haven't seen the implementation of the policy development that has been developed in consultation, which has been fundamental to where travellers have been on the back foot from the very get-go with this pandemic, and experienced it from a very disproportionate, unequal position than many of others in Irish society.
Thanks very much, Maria, and thanks very much, Jennifer. You've given us a really good overview and a very stark picture, really, of the experience of women in Ireland, in particular, women who are marginalised, and traveller women and Roma women in particular, looking at the public and private spheres and the impact in both, in terms of access to basic services, but also in terms of participation and access to decision making, and really focusing our attention, I think, on the point that Dr. Mike Ryan made earlier on as well, that that this is a culmination of decades of neglect, of decades of inequality, and that the shift really has to be investment that will also take decades. Participants here are community workers, and what we really want to focus on, in terms of our thinking today, for ourselves as community workers, is what are the challenges for community work in relation to women's inequality, and the very stark picture that's been outlined for us by both Jennifer and by Maria this morning, as well as the link that was put in by Miriam to the survey that was undertaken by the National Collective of Organisations for Women, which you can follow up on, and in terms of gathering more of that information later. But as community workers, what are the challenges for community work, and what are the key messages that we need to communicate? So we'd invite you to keep that kind of in mind over the next part of the conversation, as we ask Jennifer and Maria maybe to tell us a little bit about what their organisations were looking for during the last 18 months. What was the key message that you were trying to communicate as the National Women's Council and as the National Traveller Women's Forum about the issues facing women, and what you wanted to see in terms of change? So maybe over to you, Jennifer, on that first.
Sure. I mean, I think our right from the beginning, I think it was coming down to this issue right at the beginning about who was in those decision-making spaces, as Maria was also highlighting as well. I don't think even before the pandemic began that we needed any more consultation. We have a large number of strategies and frameworks out there, some of which look really awesome on paper, and Ireland gets a lot of kudos internationally. And I was listening to talk to Mike Ryan this morning, and there was a little piece of me sort of going, yes, it really does often look very strong on paper, our frameworks and our strategies, but it's this other step around implementation, about decision making, about making the investments that we know are so important. So we have known, for example, for a very long time that a universal public childcare system is not only the strongest intervention for all women's equality in this country, but it is also one of the best interventions we can make into poverty and deprivation. Well, we know that that's long established in research. And when the pandemic hit and women were faced with taking up these additional childcare responsibilities, we could see it really in action, like the lack of those public services. So even though there was some investment went into childcare, particularly to try and support frontline key workers and so on, it was never going to be enough because of the really partial system of, largely for-profit provision that we have in the country. So we've had frameworks, we've had strategies, we have the research, we know that that's there, but it's that lack of political will to invest in something like, in this case, public childcare, but just broadly in care. There just isn't the same valuing of it as an infrastructure in Irish society that we see as an infrastructure around energy or around building, even though the other thing that we now know is it's a far greener set of jobs and work to invest in as well. So there's a real difficulty, I think, in Ireland between consulting, drawing up strategies and frameworks, and actually implementing them, and particularly at an investment level, the kind of investment that's needed to actually deliver on universal basic services. Because that was really a really big focus of our work, was here we are seeing the importance of universal basic services, childcare, healthcare, at all kinds of, housing, as Maria was highlighting, absolute disastrous state of housing in this country, and our response for so many vulnerable parts of our community to having a sort of collective residential based approach. And we're really seeing the deficiencies of that, whether it was with family hubs and housing for people who need some sort of form of supported housing, either because they're older persons or they're women with disabilities, and the real shortcomings of that model of care was really brought out to us, I think, in the pandemic. And so I think those are some of our key messages, you know, for the National Women's Council, but also just about also trying to get women to mind themselves, you know, and that was a really big issue as well, and the supports that were needed for that. So again, I'll hand over to Maria there as well, and just watch the time going by. So there you go. Yeah.
Just following on then from that, Jennifer, I mean, I suppose for traveller women, dealing with all of the issues that I suppose we've spoken about here and that has been spoken about this morning, but also having to do that extra work and advocacy in relation to COVID has had a huge impact on even, you know, trying to rally around and support, trying to actually do the practical work that agencies and bodies of the state were supposed to do, but weren't delivered on.
Yeah.
You know, those were really critical points as well in relation to it. And I suppose some of the kind of key pieces in that, you know, traveller organisations and primary healthcare programmes were too busy trying to kick into gear, ensuring information and advice was getting out to the community, ensuring the HSE were tailoring their messaging and work to respond to the needs of the impact of COVID-19 on the community across the country. And a huge amount of that advocacy work and engagement and the messaging that we're putting out there was taking place, I suppose, within the Department of Housing at national level and within the local authorities at local level, in terms of, you know, where things, you know, particularly at local level, in terms of the role that local authorities have had and the failure, the consistent failure to deliver in terms of good quality, appropriate traveller accommodation. This was just a whole other layer that traveller women had to wade through in relation to try and protect the community and themselves. Through that work, I suppose at national level, in terms of some of the messaging that was being pushed, was the need for the Department of Housing to take a leadership role and to look at developing the circulars and the information that needed to be sent out to local authorities to get them to do what their job was to do. So trying to get them to outline the need to put in place basic services where you had unauthorised or emergency accommodation, or where you had substandard conditions. The need to look at the issues around how can travellers self-isolated in overcrowded conditions. Also, how can even families isolate from each other if they're living in one mobile home that has limited space in there? It's not like a house where you can go to different rooms. So it was around looking at responses that were going to actually be practical in terms of the needs that were happening in those communities and in those spaces in terms of travellers. Also, you know, the need to include travellers in the moratorium in relation to evictions, which didn't come easy in terms of, you know, you know, politicians were quick to come out and say, we need to stay in evictions and, you know, in terms of mainstream housing. But we had to fight harder to actually ensure evictions wouldn't continue in the context of travellers, where, you know, local authorities would have taken eviction notices to families. And also, I suppose, the other key issue, as I've already said as well, in the area of accommodation, you know, it was traveller organisations were working to try and ensure extra resources that were going into the area of education were being directed and were responding to the needs of traveller children, and working to highlight, you know, that the online learning devices were not going to meet traveller children's needs in relation to them being able to stay, you know, keep up with where they needed to be in relation to school closures. So it was across those very kind of practical, some people were taking for absolute granted. Travellers were having to grapple, and traveller women were having to grapple with those most basic of issues, and trying to get those kind of messages out and ensuring that they were being tailored to the community. I'd love to say there was others, you know, that there was higher level stuff, but a lot of it was around that basic day-to-day living. And the other part where we did try and influence as well was where Europe were looking to Ireland and saying, what are the gendered responses to this? And I suppose I spoke a little bit about that, and we fed into that at national level in the context into that survey, that EU survey, through the department responsible for it. But again, when we were seeing feedback from that, they weren't mentioning the issues as they were impacting on traveller women or other ethnic minority women, including Roma women, who were disproportionately impacted also in the context of COVID, in terms of how there was more traveller and Roma getting sicker from COVID, you know, in terms of sort of percentages, in terms of deaths from it, you know. So and again, what was spoken about this morning as well was the essential role data has to play in this, and you know, the monitoring aspect of good collection in terms of data, and we're still far from where we need to be in the Irish context in relation to ethnic minority, you know, ethnic data collection, and also disaggregated to ensure gendered aspects and analysis of it are there as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to just to pick up on that point that Maria is making there about how much focus there needed to be on just actually getting attention to be paid to the already marginalized and the already disadvantaged, and how much, like, you know, frankly, when I think about it, like the craziness of, and it wasn't just the National Women's Council, there was a lot of organizations, National Collective, National Travel, and in fact the first organizations that came forward about the gaps in the wage subsidy schemes was in fact childcare services. You know, imagine having to go and I mean, it wasn't quick. It wasn't like everybody went and said, sorry, you've made a mistake and you're managing to exclude women returning from work with this wage subsidy scheme. And it was fixed in a matter of days or weeks. It was weeks and weeks of advocacy happening, kind of going, do you realize what you've done here? You've managed to create a system where women returning from work are going to be excluded from it. Like, when you think about the nonsense that was where we were in like this part of the 21st century. So there's, and similarly trying to work with the impacts on people whose visa status was vulnerable or who were undocumented in some way, or who had no strong advocates on their behalf, like really practical things, as Maria says, like how could they be brought in and captured and given some level of income support. I mean, the National Women's Council, along with a number of other organizations, like wrote to everybody about the impact that this was having on women who'd been trafficked and women who were trafficked for commercial sexual exploitation. The response was, well, you know, they can go and get the community welfare payment if it's that bad. You're like, I'm sorry, these are women who don't want to come to the attention of the state, and that's your response. So there was very practical advocacy going on, I think, trying to draw attention to that. One big general response isn't enough, because there's been, as Maria says, decades of underinvestment and marginalization, that, you know, a lot of effort had to go on trying to bring a spotlight to those specific issues before you could even get to a more general kind of advocacy or mobilization piece as well.
Thanks, Maria and Jennifer. I think you've, you know, really, I suppose, given some very clear observations about the policy making kind of process during that period, and also about, you know, the impact of advocacy and the continuing gaps in terms of meaningful participation. And we have some interesting kind of comments in the chat as well from Jolene of Donegal Travellers Project, also kind of highlighting the gap in data and further marginalisation of travellers in Roma. And a question from Paula Flanagan asking, what would true participation look like for the various groups of women that are particularly marginalised in general and have been even more marginalised during the COVID experience? So we might put that question to Jennifer or Maria, and then I see Caoimhe also has her hands up, so maybe we could take that question after that from Caoimhe. So Maria, would you like to take a stab at Paula's question?
I mean, traveller women and travellers have been long engaged in what's called consultative forums. You know, there's consultation in relation to the area of accommodation, consultation in relation to the area of health, education, less so in terms of employment, but trying to grapple with that space where there is very little kind of, you know, policy development in relation to the you know, high levels of unemployment among travellers. So they're consultative spaces. So we have is that being translated into implementation. And that is because the spaces that we're engaging in are predominantly consultative. They aren't, they aren't kind of where the decisions are being made. They aren't where, we're involved in the consultation, but somebody else is responsible for the implementation. And there is absolutely no accountability when it comes to the implementation of, or lack of implementation of traveller accommodation. So these consultative forums, like local traveller accommodation consultative committees, the National Traveller Accommodation Consultative Committee, the education consultative spaces, the health consultative spaces, they need to have more teeth. They need to have decision-making powers so that when the bodies and the agencies of the state are not delivering, there can be accountability, there can be consequence. And in those spaces, they are too light and they are about consultation. They're not about the decision-making. And also, if I could just also make a wider point as well, in terms of where you have wider gender discussion spaces or consultative spaces, you are not seeing traveller women or other ethnic minority women around those tables. So in 2019, the Department of Health established a task force on women's health to improve women's health outcomes and outputs, and also to build trust in the health services. Traveller organisations have asked time and time again for a space at that table and have been refused by the Department of Health in relation to that space. So where you have wider spaces that are making decisions in relation to women, whether it be in health, politics, housing, traveller women, it's not seen that traveller women should be part of those decision-making spaces either. And that's a real problem. Because then what's coming out of it is not reflecting the issues and experiences for traveller women. But the core point I do want to make, that consultative spaces have a role, but consultative spaces alone, without being really really having the teeth to either, not so much to implement, but to actually hold to account the bodies and agencies of this state that are not implementing their own policy in relation to traveller health, in relation to traveller and education, in relation to traveller and accommodation, is a real problem in relation to it. And also that political will, because, at the end of the day, if there's a will from a political perspective, you will see more happening. There has never been, in any real sense of the word, that political will when it comes to implementation of traveller policy, and because there isn't any consequence for them, and there isn't any accountability where local authorities are failing in their own accommodation programs. There is no sanctions, there is nothing being imposed. There's resources aren't taken away from the local authority in other areas, and resources is a huge issue. And, adequate resources in relation to right across the board with traveller policy. But I suppose accommodation is one area where in the past, when there was adequate resources, we still weren't seeing a translation or a change in the lived lives of travellers on the ground in relation to accommodation. We're still seeing significant underspends where, in terms of traveller accommodation budgets, where local authorities are not only not implementing their own policy, but where they have resources to do so, they're still not doing it, and yet there's still no consequence for them. And that's the other thing as well. How long do you continue to do that? And how long do you continue to stand over that as a state? So we have seen the Irish, national government remove services from local authorities when they weren't delivering on their objectives in relation to that, whether it be in the environment, whether it be in roads, or whether it be elsewhere. We have not seen the same interference or coming in to say, well, look, you've over 20 years of failed policy context in relation to delivery of proper accommodation, and therefore you're not seeing national government coming in and imposing sanctions. You're not seeing them coming in and removing powers from local authority to ensure we find ways and mechanisms for that implementation to happen.
Thanks, Maria. Really drawing a very clear distinction and illuminating, through your examples of the distinction between consultation and participation, which I think is largely overlooked within the policy making sphere, in terms of how the government lead it, and also giving us a really, I suppose, clear example of why political will is at the back of it all in terms of policy change. Caoimhe, you had your hand up. Caoimhe McCabe from Pavy Point.
Oh yeah, thanks. No, I was just going to add to that. I work in the communications information side of things in Pavy Point, and I think one of the things, and I suppose Dr. Ryan talked to it a little bit about it, this whole idea of like having things, changing strategies mid-course, and been able to bring these issues to the fore at the time. And Jennifer mentioned it to it there, and how difficult that was. And I kind of reflected basically a lack of interest on behalf of the media in a lot of these things, which is there anyway. And I know, like, when we were speaking to people, traveler families who were struggling, and we were trying to get them, to talk about this thing like publicly, at the time, like, people were so afraid that they were actually going to lose the bit of progress that they thought was going to come with COVID. Like, for example, that they were actually going to get water after 15 years of waiting for it. They didn't want to jeopardize that. And, that's how, like, desperate people were and are, I suppose. And how that is blocking, that whole kind of sense of disempowerment is actually blocking people, women in these situations, from speaking out, and actually being able to get their story across. And I think that for community organizations, I think the whole, community development work and giving people a space where they can do that, is like something that is needed, because now people are so, so busy trying to survive. Where are you going to get the space to kind of like stand aside and, recreate a movement that's going to, bring this forward? It takes a huge amount of energy to do that. So I think and a lot of it was spearheaded by, the lack of interest on the part of the media in a lot of what we're talking about, which equates with the lack of political will. It's just like, largely speaking, these issues are important for us, but they're not important for a lot of people outside of this room. And, it's trying to make it important. That is difficult, and trying to get that across. So I just thought I'd mention that.
Thanks, Caoimhe. And Michael Birmingham from North Wall would like to come in. Michael, did I see your hand?
Oh, you did. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, all good.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I was just thinking in terms of even like when Maria was saying, even like about removing power from the local authorities in terms of accommodation, and how they haven't responded to the kind of disaster that traveller families have found themselves in for generations in terms of accommodation and most every other area of life. That and maybe it's also broadly in relation to gender about removing power, because when he was Mike Ryan was talking about, when you sit down and talk, something has to give on both sides. And I was thinking, we talk about empowerment, but it's like without power, it's like some sort of theory of empowerment. But like, we see in Iceland, there's one parliament, the whole of Europe, that's finally managed to have more women than men. When you kind of think, well, that unless that happens, there's no reason for that to not happen immediately at a national level, why there should be so few women in power across all the areas of main power in this country, including local authorities. But I was thinking as well, like in relation to even we're talking about the social determinants of health, and how it's like, again, like Maria and like mine were saying about it's a decades long process that, like, we see, I mean, I know probably everyone else here probably knows a lot more about that process, but when I see what happened in terms of the All Ireland Traveller Health Survey in 2010, I don't know if there's any survey that was as comprehensive a process looking into the social determinants of health. I mean, like the traveller community, the traveller organisations, traveller women in particular, like the Traveller Women's Forum, are really when it's shocking for me. I mean, I should know it's shocking that I don't know, but that let's say the traveller women have had to fight and are still not getting into the processes, like, that are looking into COVID and the impact on women, not just in relation to like, one of the things that jumped out at me from the All Ireland Traveller Health Survey was that it wasn't a catastrophe. It wasn't, no government fell, there was no front page headlines. We don't see like the likes of the Ryan report into industrial schools, reaction. It was just another survey, whereas it seemed to me to be just like someone else there said that this on the ground, these things, the consultation reports come out with it. And when people were talking about like the travellers having 6 times the suicide rate of settled people, of 95% maybe experiencing unemployment, of the experiences of homelessness vastly greater than settled people in every area of life that's most difficult almost in Ireland, incredibly experienced by travellers, particularly by traveller women. Like, traveller communities have highlighted in like things like what they we call intersectionality, but like issues for women, issues for people with disabilities. I mean, if we were to look at a social determinants of health approach in Ireland, like the traveller community are probably it's not just that they experienced the most catastrophic levels of racism that almost imaginable, like that, and that the Irish, even when it is beyond a doubt in the most clear way described in 2010, it's just a shrug of the shoulders from the Irish society. But it's not just that level of catastrophe, it's like the expertise into how you actually understand the social determinants of health and explain it and do something about it. It seems to me from outside that the travellers, particularly traveller women, are the source of, not the universities, but it's actually the traveller community and traveller organisations and travellers that are the source of expertise that the entire Irish society could probably rely on to inform not just the response to travellers, but the response to the social determinants of health and tackling inequality, all inequalities in Irish society. And like, they're not even at the decision-making table still for all the talk and all the consultation. It's, in one sense, it's really bleak, but I mean, it's still heartwarming to see the people still fight, I mean, that, and I guess because fighting, I guess it won't change. Obviously it's not changing without real fights. I mean, sorry. Yeah.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks to Caoimhe as well for your really important point, which Paula is also highlighting in terms of how we communicate our message, and I think that relates as well to Michael, to your point in terms of the expertise, and it brings us really as well to what we want to focus on, I suppose, for the last 10 to 15 minutes of this workshop, which is, what is the challenge for community work? I think we've discussed that and outlined what the challenges are very well, but what are the key messages that we as community workers now need to communicate? What are the actions that we need to take? And what we'd like to try and do in the next 10 to 15 minutes is, from this workshop, what is our call to action on this theme for community workers? And when we go back into the main room, then Kate will put that in, will communicate that on our behalf back to the kind of plenary space, and we'll hear from the other workshops as well. So building on what we have so far, what are the key messages that we as community workers need to communicate, and what are the actions that we as community workers need to take? So we'll maybe start by hearing from Jennifer, your views on that, and open the floor then to Maria and to other participants.
Well, I suppose the thing that I'm struck by here is, and I suppose Maria spoke about it very movingly in relation to the traveller community, but we could, if this had been a workshop around disabled women, we would have heard something very similar. We would have heard the same challenges for women of ethnic minorities, which is accountability and is ultimately about political power. And somebody, I'm sorry, I caught it very quickly in the chat there, somebody asking, how do we, so we're hearing about consultation, how do we make sure that we get our policies moved forward? The reality is it's about political power at the end of the day, and we all need to be building political power, either through social movements or through a better exercise of our democratic processes, including for women and minority groups in this country, the recognition we need quotas. We need quotas at local government, we need quotas in local structures. So both the Minister and Dr. Ryan were referencing the PPNs. The PPNs are fine. They are the only, statutorily recognised participation process at a local level. But we, where the political power lies is inside local government, it's in national government. And I would love to think that the solution is if we had 51% of all representatives being women, but I know that's not true. It has to be women who have a commitment to policies and a commitment to political power and decision making that is inclusive. It's about equality and it's about progressive values that we can all support, that the people in this room can support, not just women. That's why I say the National Women's Council over the last few years has quite changed some of the ways in which it calls for that. We want women, but we want women who are feminist and who believe in those values and will exercise those values, because that's how we call it. So when Maria named all those strategies, all those consultations, all that money that lies unspent, unless those people could be held to account, then that will continue to exist. And that's through political power. So I think we need to be thinking in those kinds of terms, social movements, yes, representative democracy, but also participatory democracy, and improving and building on those structures as well. I could say a lot more, but I'll just stop there. I'm sure Maria has lots of ideas as well.
No, I'll be brief, but I mean, I think that if you're looking at what kind of call for action is needed, you are looking at the need for targeted action in relation to ethnic minority women, including traveller women. So you are looking at very targeted approaches. You are looking at, like the PPNs, very briefly, they haven't worked for travellers in any way, shape or means. And it was another tool as well at local level in terms of local politics, in terms of, exclusion. And even where there was engagement, the way they're constructed did not work in a way that was conducive to very many marginalised and excluded groups. Because there's very different views on what community work and community development are, and opinions and views from different strands of the community are as far apart from human rights, the principles underpinning human rights and community development, in any kind of real participatory way, to ensure you are going to have outcomes. And I think that's the other bit as well, when we talk about what are the actions we needed. We want to see real change. There needs to be real change on the ground for communities. There needs to be real change on the ground for travellers. And political power is only one part of it, because, travellers, because, there's, in terms of, it's not going to be today or tomorrow in terms of that significant change that's needed in the political space to ensure travellers have a real opportunity and meaningful opportunity to have those opportunities at political level. And when you're looking at the women context, then you are looking at the need for ethnic quotas in relation to, but not just ethnic quotas. There needs to be specific targets within that for traveller women. You also are looking at we've had politicians who've made the most atrocious comments in relation to travellers, who did not have any kind of redress. And we've seen it at the most recent, in terms of sort of at the presidential election, when a candidate came out with, really atrocious comments in relation to travellers, and been going up higher in votes. So there needs to be a whole kind of in terms of that kind of political space and where political power lies, and rebalance, and not rebalance, and a need to address that in relation to where where travellers are in terms of that. But I mean, unless there's kind of targeted action taken, you are not going to see some of this. And the other bit as well is that, you know, the pandemic has shown that there is a different way of doing things in some areas. Now, not across the board, but, you know, so how do you try and make sure that where that has worked in the way it needed to, that, as is spoken really well about this morning, we don't go back to what was the previous norm or abnormal in the context of, you know, where some of the most marginalized groups, you know, have been coming from, in terms of it. So I suppose those were just some of the points I want to make in the context of the actions going forward. Very much targeted actions needed and adequate resources in relation to, because we have the strategies. You know, we have strategies. We have the National Traveller and Roma Inclusion Strategy with various recommendations that's coming to an end this year that has not in any way been implemented in the way it needed to be. We have the health strategy with huge amount of unimplemented recommendations, and in the area of education with policy that didn't go far enough. But you know, so I mean, where we do have policy development, we are not seeing the monitoring, the targeting, the resources, and the outcomes in relation to them, and we need to see more of that focus on that.
Thanks, Maria. That's very clear. You know, I think as being community workers, calling for implementation, for resourcing, for monitoring and evaluation, and very importantly for accountability from the policy framework.
Ciara, can I just say something? I just want to be really clear. I mean, when I was saying political power, I think I was probably saying pretty much what Maria was saying, because I was meaning political in that really broad sense about holding elected representatives to account. Because I think, and somebody put into the chat there, sorry again, I'm not catching the names as I do this, like I think the community sector can do that. It's not just about putting forward people as politicians, it's about that real fundamental kind of accountability and moving from more of a representative democracy to a participatory democracy. And I think, you know, we need to see some of that. We need to see proper devolution of power and decision making and budgeting, frankly, into more local ways of working, so that we can be closer to those levers of power and can exert more accountability on representatives, but also committees who often have some of the strongest implementation powers. It's not really just politicians, it's committees and some of those forums that aren't working well at the moment, I think, as well.
Yeah. And Ciara, if I could just make one very final brief point as well in this context of this, it is really a need also to deconstruct the systemic racism that exists within our institutions, you know, because that is why we have the level of marginalization and we have the level of exclusion, and the absolute overall lack of implementation of policy in the context of travellers. And unless that is absolutely deconstructed in relation to institutional racism and called out for what it is. Yeah. You know, we'll still be having these conversations, unfortunately, in another 10, 15 years, because travellers have been having them for many, very, very, very many decades now. And we did not need to be told what are the issues. We know what the issues are. We've been long saying them, but we are not seeing the will where it lies in terms of where the state and it has a fundamental role, a key role in relation to that change, without eradicating a whole group of people, which has been the approach through assimilation prior to, where we did have a voice and were able to consult in relation to the policy and the issues that directly affect us, but we are not seeing implementation of that. And the reason we're not seeing the accountability and the consequence is because of the systemic and institutional racism in relation to topics.
Thanks, Maria. So what we hope to leave with in 3 minutes is our one call to action for community workers. So bearing that in mind, could we hear briefly from Jolene from the Donegal Traveller Project, and then also from Miriam from the National Community, the Collective of Women's organisations.
Yeah, I just want to add my voice to those callings that we really need this strong implementation and monitoring of, like, we have all of these strategies, and COVID shone a light on things, but we've been seeing these issues long before. Like we had the Traveller All Ireland Health Study, we had the Roma National Needs Assessment. We've had those documents that highlighted these issues for us long before COVID brought them to wider attention. But we need those strategies like the NITRIS to really have that strong implementation. And just also in terms of women, Dr. McBrien mentioned about not seeing people just as economic units. We need to value women's lived experiences and resilience. Particularly, there's a push now to get everybody back to work, but I think that pushing particularly minority ethnic women into like precarious, low-paid, insecure unemployment, that's not empowerment, and that's not going to change anything for women. And we need to value women beyond just their contribution in PRSI.
Absolutely, Jolene, and to structure the system where that doesn't have implications for their retirement and health and so on into older age. Miriam, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, as others have said, and Jennifer in particular put up in the chat about women's community development sector, like community workers and community work was really valued throughout the pandemic. That was sometimes the only way of reaching marginalized communities. And that's something that needs to continue to be valued and resourced, as Maria and others have said. In terms of accountability as a sector, we're highly accountable, both to our funders, but particularly to the communities we work with. But there is no, that we have, as Jennifer has said, good strategies on paper, good policies on paper, but accountability is not built into those. Like the implementation is the problem, but also there has to be accountability. So what happens if targets are not reached? So what happens if those that the policies are meant to reach do not reach? And in terms of, I suppose, funding, in terms of resources, yes, there was funding, there was different pieces of funding throughout the pandemic, but it was piecemeal and it wasn't anything that was sustainable. So you ended up as community workers trying to fit in under pieces of funding in order to get that for your community. So it's a time to look at all that in terms of how the resourcing can be used to empower women, particularly marginalised women.
Thanks.
Ciara, if I could make one very final brief point. I mean, many traveller organisations in the midst of the last 18 or 19 months have found themselves more in service-led roles than community development roles, because agencies and others responsible for providing services would not go in on the ground and provide them. So traveller organisations had found themselves in no other position. This was kind of life and death. This was survival. So had to go in and provide those kind of service-led supports. So there is a really kind of, there's a bit of a kind of, now, I mean, some of that's still ongoing, of course it is. But there's also, in terms of that reaffirming community development and the ethos and the principles underpinning it in terms from a human rights framework, and ensuring that in how we go forward in terms of community development, that yes, it's not about leaving people behind and not having access to services, but it's also not losing this a sense of ourselves as a movement in relation to equality and human rights. And it's a thin balancing line at times. Some organizations felt, I need to hold the line here, and there are bodies and agencies that provide these services and I need to hold them to account. But that couldn't have happened in all areas, because it meant that if traveller organisations hadn't stepped into that breach, those members of the community would have been in much more dire situations. But there is work for us in terms of how we kind of rebalance that a little bit as well, without leaving people behind, and without leaving people in worse situations. But in terms of kind of the ethos, in terms of underpinning the principles of community development, and also in terms of human rights.
Thanks, Maria. And I think there's a strong line in what people are saying, between that distinction that was made earlier between consultation and participation. And as community workers, maybe shifting our focus from being in spaces where there's consultation happening to demanding participation and accountability, because they're so linked in terms of outcomes. I think we have about 3 more minutes left. So are there any final voices? Or Kate, would you like to say something about what you have, and maybe we can reflect back on that across the workshop?
Yeah, so as part of my role, I need to put into this clipboard what our call is. So what I have so far, but please correct me if it's wrong. So we're calling for strong implementation of all strategies, policies in relation to women, including BME women, in relation to monitoring, targeting, resources, outcomes, and most importantly, accountability by all stakeholders. In brackets, I have participation rather than consultation. Is there anything that I've missed, or do you think it's correct in what I've said?
I suppose what we're talking about is what we demand as community workers. As community workers, this is what we see as needing to happen, or as this is what we see as what the focus needs to be for community workers at this time to demand this. Ursula, from Jocus.
I just want to say, is it strong enough? Because it seems to me that, going back to what Mike Ryan said, that you know, the community is the most important. So the grassroots is the most important at finding solutions to problems, but also in getting us back on our feet. And I think listening to Maria, listening to everybody, we're talking about that. We're actually talking about the involvement and the engagement of the people that know best about what they need. And we can do all the consultations. But one of the things that always worked well and was in a sense taken away from us was the recognition and the proper resourcing of community development work. If you get me, the proper resourcing. So the women's community sector was decimated, as was other sectors. And I think the result of that, I work locally as one of the 17 branches with the NCCWN, working with all women. But basically, we have to work really, really hard at the minute to re-engage and to ensure a lot of different things. But we're not resourced to do that. And I think that we've got to say very strongly that you know, that the women's community sector, based on community development principles, we need to be resourced. And that's the same. Other areas are going to say the same. But please look to the community sector. We're extremely important.